Scotland made a desperate billion-dollar gamble. It lost. Right now, 400,000 properties, 1 in 8 homes across the country, are already in the flood risk zone. By 2100, that number will rise to 634,000. So Scotland did something no one expected. But first, let's go back to October 2023, Brecon. In a town of 7,000 people, the River South Esk breached defenses that had been built specifically to stop it. Residents were evacuated by boat. Businesses that had survived for generations did not reopen. The damage bill for that single storm ran into hundreds of millions of pounds. This wasn't a freak event, it was a preview. Aberdeenshire is consistently projected to experience the largest growth in flood risk of any Scottish region, with between 7,500 and 15,000 additional properties entering the risk zone depending on how much temperatures rise. Glasgow and West Lothian follow closely. Aberdeen city centre already faces a 10% annual probability of river flooding, meaning that in any given decade, a serious flood is not a possibility. It is a near certainty. By 2100, peak river flow across Scotland is projected to rise by 60%, rainfall intensity by 50%, sea levels by up to 190 centimeters in the worst scenarios. The storms are getting stronger, the land is getting wetter, and the gap between what Scotland's flood defenses can handle and what nature is delivering is widening every year. The flood projections in the SEPA report are alarming. What they do not show is what happens to a community before the water arrives. In flood risk zones across Scotland, insurance premiums have already begun to climb to levels that many households cannot sustain. Properties in areas newly identified as medium or high risk are seeing valuations fall. Mortgage lenders are increasingly reluctant to approve loans on homes that appear on flood risk maps, even when those homes have never flooded. Young families who bought their first home in a Scottish river town 5 years ago are now discovering that the asset they built their financial lives around may be uninsurable within a decade. This is the slow-motion economic crisis that runs alongside the physical one. Flooding does not just destroy homes when it arrives. It destroys the value of homes and the financial security of families years before the water gets there. And it falls hardest on those who can least afford it. Affluent households can move, they can absorb higher premiums, they can buy in safer postcodes. The families who cannot, who are locked into properties in flood-prone areas because that is what they could afford, are the ones who will be left holding assets that the market has already written off. Stonehaven sits on the northeast coast of Scotland, south of Aberdeen. It is the kind of town that people describe as resilient, a fishing community with deep roots, a high street that survived decades of economic change, a sense of identity that outlasted everything thrown at it. In August 2020, Storm Ellen delivered rainfall that overwhelmed the town's drainage systems in hours. The high street flooded. Shops that had traded through 2 world wars did not reopen after the storm. Several did not reopen at all. Stonehaven was not on any major flood risk list before that night. It appeared on several of them afterward. This is the pattern that the 2025 SEPA assessment captures in aggregate but cannot convey in human terms. Behind every number in that report is a Stonehaven, a high street, a family business, a home that someone worked 30 years to own, and that is now worth less than the mortgage on it. Scotland has spent significant sums on flood protection infrastructure. Concrete barriers, steel floodgates, raised embankments along river corridors that have been identified as high risk. The results have been partial at best. The fundamental problem is hydraulic. Traditional flood defenses work by containing water, holding it within a channel and raising the bank so it cannot escape. But as rainfall intensifies and river flows increase, the volume of water that needs to be contained grows beyond what fixed structures can handle. You can raise a flood wall, but you cannot raise it faster than the water is rising. There is also a distribution problem. Surface water flooding, water that overwhelms drainage systems during intense rainfall rather than overflowing from rivers, is now projected to add over 200,000 properties to Scotland's flood risk map. Surface water does not respect flood walls. It comes from above, not below, and no amount of riverside engineering addresses it. Scotland has been fighting the symptom. The cause, a landscape that has lost its ability to absorb and slow water, has gone largely unaddressed. 500 years ago, Scotland's rivers did not behave the way they behave today. They were slow. They spread sideways into vast floodplains and wetland systems that absorbed rainfall the way a sponge absorbs water. Scotland once had around 330,000 hectares of functioning wetland. Today, over 90% of that is gone. The reason those wetlands existed, the reason the rivers were slow, was something that disappeared from Scotland in the 1500s, and that almost nobody connected to the flooding crisis until recently: beavers. Every dam a beaver builds slows water down, spreads it sideways, creates pools and marshy floodplains that hold water back during storms and release it slowly during dry spells. For thousands of years, beaver engineering was Scotland's natural flood defense system. When beavers were hunted to extinction, killed for their fur, their meat, and castoreum, a glandular secretion prized in European perfumeries, the rivers lost their architects. The floods that followed lasted 4 centuries. They are still happening now. In 2001, a canoeist spotted a beaver on the River Erne in Perthshire, an animal extinct in Scotland for nearly 5 centuries, already building a dam as if it had never left. No one had released it officially. No one had planned for it. It had simply appeared and started working. What followed became one of the most closely monitored ecological experiments in British history. By 2009, Scotland launched its first official beaver reintroduction in Knapdale Forest. Scientists installed pressure sensors, flow gauges, and camera traps throughout the waterways. A University of Exeter study analyzing over 1,000 storm events found that beaver dams reduce average flood flows by up to 60%. In Devon, wetlands created by beavers stored over 24 million liters of water during heavy rainfall, the equivalent of 10 Olympic swimming pools, held back by nothing but sticks, mud, and instinct. The lead hydrologist reviewed the data and said only one thing: their computer models could not reproduce what had happened in the field. The detail that stopped engineers cold was not the volume, it was the resilience. A concrete dam requires inspection crews and maintenance budgets. A beaver dam, partially destroyed by a flood, rebuilds itself within days, stronger and better adapted than before. Scotland had spent generations building flood defenses that fought water. The beaver builds with it. Scotland is not the only country facing this problem, and it is not the only country that has looked to nature for part of the answer. The Netherlands, a country where a significant portion of the land sits below sea level, has spent decades developing what it calls room for the river. Instead of building higher walls, the Dutch have been systematically widening floodplains, relocating farms, and restoring wetland areas along major river corridors. The result is a flood management system that absorbs water rather than fighting it, and that has dramatically reduced flood risk across a densely populated country. Germany, following catastrophic flooding in 2021 that killed over 180 people, began accelerating its investment in natural flood management. Beaver populations that had been reintroduced across German river systems were recognized explicitly in federal flood policy as contributing to water retention, the first time a European government formally acknowledged the hydraulic value of beaver engineering in national infrastructure planning. In Poland, where beaver populations have recovered to over 100,000 animals, the largest in Europe, researchers have documented measurable reductions in downstream flood peaks in river catchments with high beaver density. Scotland has the data. It has the animals. What it lacks is the scale and the urgency. In 2016, the Scottish government announced that beavers could stay permanently. In 2019, they received protected species status. Today, Scotland has around 2,000 wild beavers, and the population is growing. But 2,000 beavers across an entire country is not a flood defense system. It is a beginning. Scotland has tens of thousands of kilometers of rivers and streams. To make a meaningful contribution to flood attenuation at a national scale, beaver populations would need to be distributed strategically across the catchments that feed the highest-risk communities, including Aberdeenshire, Glasgow, and the river systems that drain into Aberdeen, Stonehaven, and Brecon. The Scottish Government's National Flood Resilience Strategy, published in December 2024, does include nature-based solutions alongside traditional engineering. It mentions restored wetlands, expanded floodplains, and increased woodland cover as components of a national approach. It is a step forward, but the strategy's own timeline extends to 2045, and the floods are not waiting. In 2020 alone, NatureScott carried out 68 active beaver conflict mitigation projects across Tayside, installing flow devices, negotiating with landowners, and managing boundaries. The infrastructure for coexistence is being built, but the pace of expansion, cautious, managed, and politically careful, does not match the pace of what the 2025 SEPA projections describe. How many beavers does Scotland actually need? This is the question that flood engineers and conservation ecologists are beginning to ask together, which is itself a sign of how much has changed. Research from multiple European countries suggests that meaningful flood attenuation requires beaver activity across a significant proportion of a catchment's tributary network. A single beaver family can manage several kilometers of stream. A catchment the size of the Tay, one of Scotland's largest river systems, would require hundreds of active beaver territories distributed across its upper reaches to produce measurable effects on downstream flood peaks. Scotland currently has around 2,000 beavers, concentrated primarily in Tayside. Ecologists estimate the country could support 10 to 20 times that number across suitable habitat that already exists in the form of river corridors, commercial forestry, and upland stream networks that currently contribute to flooding rather than preventing it. The cost of expanding Scotland's beaver population to that scale is a fraction of a single year's flood defense infrastructure budget. The maintenance cost is zero. The beavers do it themselves. 400,000 properties at risk today, 634,000 by 2100. That gap, 234,000 additional properties, represents families, communities, and towns that will enter the flood risk zone within the lifetime of children who are alive right now. It represents insurance premiums that will become unaffordable, mortgages that banks will refuse, high streets that will empty before the water arrives. Scotland is not facing a distant hypothetical. It is facing a compressing timeline and a choice about how to respond. The engineering answer costs billions and keeps failing. The nature-based answer costs a fraction of that, and 1,000 storm events of data show it works. Not instead of infrastructure, alongside it. Rivers with active beaver populations, restored wetlands, and functioning floodplains absorb what concrete walls cannot. The question is no longer whether this approach works. The question is whether Scotland moves fast enough. In February 2025, the British government announced a new licensing system for wild beaver releases across England. Wales is considering its first projects. The model that began with one escaped animal on the River Erne in 2001 is now national policy across Britain. But Scotland, the country that ran the original experiment, that has the data, that has the population already in place, is still expanding cautiously while the flood projections climb. The rivers that beavers shaped for thousands of years are the same rivers now threatening 400,000 Scottish homes. The connection is not metaphorical, it is hydraulic. Remove the engineers who built the natural flood defense system, and 4 centuries later you get the crisis that SEPA published in 2025.